Well, good afternoon from London, and thanks for joining me, Lyn Julius, for this lecture, Sephardi Post-War Migrations to the West. 850,000 Jews were forced to leave Arab countries in the second half of the 20th century. The majority fled to Israel, but 200,000 resettled in the West. These people are the focus of my talk today. Not all Sephardi Jews or Mizrahi, that's Eastern Jews, arrived in the West after World War II. In the 19th century, Moroccan Jews moved to Brazil and settled in the Amazon and remote Atlantic islands like Cape Verde and the Azores. At the turn of the last century, Syrian, Iraqi, and Turkish Jews left for Europe, Central and South America. Syrian Jews settled in New York as early as 1892 to escape the draft or for economic opportunity. At a baby's brit in Syria, a family might pray, "May he live in Manchester," the great new hub of the textile industry in Britain. Over 30,000 Sephardi Jewish immigrants moved to France from the crumbling Ottoman Empire before World War II. But the mass exodus really occurred after Israel was founded in 1948 and new independent Arab countries were established. Jewish communities took the road into exile. Families were often dispersed across the world. Members went to Israel, to France, to England, to Canada, to Australia, to North, Central and South America. And here you actually see immigrants from Morocco arriving in Canada. Jews living in Arab countries had realized that they had no future in countries where they had lived for centuries, if not millennia. Arab nationalism marginalized non-Muslim minorities. Arab regimes passed discriminatory laws, leading to economic strangulation. Greeks, Armenians, Italians, and Maltese were also leaving, but Jews uniquely were singled out as victims of a violent backlash to the establishment of Israel. Once a family had decided to leave, what factors influenced its decision? Most left for Israel, where they already had family, but many were put off moving to Israel, especially in the 1950s. There were scorpions, there was food rationing, and they would have to live in a tent. Israel simply did not have enough housing for the refugees, and so they were consigned to ma'abarot, or transit camps. Some of these lasted for years and gradually turned into permanent towns. Families with sons also balked at the prospect of their serving in the Israeli army. France exerted a pull on many Jewish refugees, even those who did not have French citizenship. Middle-class Jews tended to be acculturated and had assimilated to colonial values. They were educated in missionary schools, convents, or had acquired a Western education in French in the schools of the Alliance Israélite Universelle. They were in love with France and French culture. French was the lingua franca of the upper classes. This meant that the Jewish refugees might not feel entirely at ease in a Jewish country. This was the case with the great writer André Aciman, whose family left Egypt in 1967 and ultimately moved to the US. In his book, Out of Egypt, Aciman wrote, "I am a Jew who longs to be in a world where everyone is Jewish, where I can let down my guard and, like left-handed people who have been forced to do things with their right, use my left hand as freely as I wish. But I am a Jew who's spent so long defining himself in relation to Gentiles that I wouldn't know how to live, much less who to be, in a world in which everyone was Jewish. We were staunch Zionists, but Israel was for other Jews, for real Jews. Our capital was, we thought, Paris, Le Petit Paris. Our images of a better life were projected onto Paris, but an imaginary Paris. Just to make things more complicated, during my last few days in Egypt, I began to miss Egypt, but I could not wait to leave Egypt. At the end of the book, I stand along the Corniche looking out at the Mediterranean, thinking, over there is France. But I know that once in France, I'll look back to this very evening and long to be here in Egypt. Not to be back here, but to be here longing for France. But for more Arabized Jews, the transition was harder to make. The Bokovsa family left the Tunisian town of Sfax for Paris. They were not prepared for the change in the pace of life. They began running as soon as they arrived. Shoshana Bokovza writes, "In Paris, he who cannot run, poor thing, is done for. Time ran faster in exile." Moreover, since their arrival, everything seemed harder, more complicated. There was a host of reasons why. Reason number one was there was no sun in Paris, no real light, the white kind that dazzles your eyes, that makes sweat trickle from your pores and which separates day from night. Reason number two, the city is huge, and to get from one end to the other, you have to take the metro, the bus, sometimes both. Reason number three, the more you work, the more you consume, and the more you consume, the more you work. In short, you haven't got time to take your time. At least in Sfax, even though we were poor, we enjoyed life. We left Tunisia, but Tunisia did not want to leave us. Shoshana Bokovza explains that her grandfather, a shohet or ritual slaughterer, had brought his sharpened knives with him. In the week they arrived, her mother scoured Paris looking for a live chicken to prepare for Shabbat. She found a cockerel on the quayside and paid top price for it. I quote, "The chicken remained under the kitchen sink in our tiny apartment on the Rue de la Roquette. He used to crow at dawn. Puzzled, the neighbors scoured the building looking for him. They asked her mother, 'Did you hear a cockerel crow?' 'No,' she answered, mortified. As soon as the door shut, she told my grandfather, 'Quick, kill that cockerel and be done with. In this city, the police come after those who keep live birds in their apartments.'" In any event, Western countries had to prepare to receive a sudden influx of post-colonial refugees, not just Jews. France had long been a transit point for refugees. Many arrived in Marseille from North Africa during the 1950s and 60s. This is the Camp d'Arenas, and it had 80 barrels in the former barracks, and they at first housed European Jews during World War II. The barrels were built in 1945 by the French government as a camp for German POWs and later Indo-Chinese workers. The camp then became known as the Camp des Juifs. 40,000 Jews passed through on their way to Israel. Several families shared one barrel. Conditions were difficult. very hot in summer and cold in winter. The camp was closed down in 1966 and demolished in 1973. And here are two more pictures of these rather futuristic looking barrels. Some of the Jewish middle classes chose to move to Europe because they already had connections. They might have had relatives already living in England or France. They might have sent out their children to finish their education in a Western school, university, and the rest of the family simply followed. Nora Kraft's story is fairly typical. She was 15 when she was sent away from Alexandria in Egypt to school in France. In 1957, her parents arrived in Genoa from Alexandria and then moved to Paris. They received no financial assistance. Their suitcase was stolen. The family rented a large apartment in Paris. They could not afford the rent and so sublet the apartment to 5 families. Nora's mum went out to work as a nurse. Nora worked as the supervisor of the girls' dormitory at her school in order to pay the fees. When the family eventually moved to Switzerland, the father had trouble finding work. And sadly, the displacement took its toll, in particular on men. It's astonishing how many fell ill or had heart attacks or simply died or even committed suicide after their uprooting. The first great challenge to Western governments was the Suez Crisis, sparked by the ill-fated invasion by Britain, France, and Israel of the Sinai, an attempt to stop President Nasser of Egypt from nationalizing the Suez Canal. As a result, Nasser turned on British and French citizens and expelled them. Many Jews were among them. Jews were also expelled if they had Greek, Italian, or even Egyptian citizenship. This shows that the Egyptian policy was not just xenophobic, it was anti-Semitic. And here you see a laissez-passer that was issued to a Jew who actually had Egyptian citizenship. And it says, valable pour un seul voyage. In other words, you're allowed to leave the country, but you can't come back. Some 30,000 Jews were expelled after 1956. The original community numbered about 80,000 in 1948, and by 1950, about 20,000 had already left, mainly for Israel. Several thousand Jews were of Italian citizenship, although they had never been to Italy. On the day they were deported from Egypt, Carolina del Burgo recalls being on a bus full only of women and children. The Egyptian officers confiscated all gold jewelry, including wedding rings. Everyone was pushed into the ship, the Achilleos. It was full of expelled Jews with their families. Carolina del Burgo's father had been imprisoned in Egypt and was put in handcuffs until the boat had left Egyptian waters. 50 years later, in 2006, Carolina visited the Boca di Puglia refugee camp at Brindisi, which housed her family. And I couldn't find a sort of a more up-to-date map than this one, but you can just see Brindisi there at the tip of the heel of Italy. And there's another refugee camp which I shall be talking about, and that's Capua, just south of Rome. So Carolina visited the refugee camp where she was housed with her family. She discovered that the authorities were planning to pull down the camp. And that's when she decided to convince the municipality of Brindisi to erect a memorial to Egyptian Jewish refugees, as well as to those citizens of Brindisi who helped absorb them. And what makes this exodus of Jews with Italian nationality particularly disturbing is that Italy did not take part in the Suez campaign. The Suez crisis also caused the expulsion at some 24 hours notice, some of them, of British nationals. And when I say British nationals, these were Jews who were nominally British, though through some quirk of history, but often did not speak English or had never been to England. Britain only took in 6,000, almost all British nationals, apart from 200 stateless Jews. That was much less than France. France took in 11,000 Jews from Egypt in total, including 4,000 stateless or refugees of other nationalities. This is Clemmy Lazarus's story. She's née Menhir. Her mother was British, although her father was stateless. I quote, "As a consequence of the Suez Crisis, my mother, along with all British and French citizens, were unceremoniously expelled from Egypt. I have a memory of military personnel marching through our apartment delivering the expulsion order. This caused my parents and grandparents severe heartache, as my parents had 5 children, and my mother was, at the time, 6 months pregnant with number 6. She was obliged to leave for England on her own without her husband, but with 5 children in tow. She was 24 years of age at the time. She spoke French and Arabic, but no English, and she knew no other culture than the Jewish Egyptian one in which she grew up. She was compelled to leave without any money or possessions of any value. She did, however, manage to buy a few gold bangles that she wore as jewelry and sold for the purpose of sustaining us down the line. Once in England, my mother was housed in a refugee camp, first in Leeds and then in Kidderminster. These were essentially former wooden army barrack huts. When my mother was ready to deliver her baby, my siblings and I were placed in the guardianship of the British Red Cross, and she was taken to the local hospital to give birth. This was a particularly harrowing time for her, as she had no means of communicating her concerns. During this time, our suitcases were ransacked, and many fine Cacharel clothes were stolen. Added to this, my mother returned from hospital to find that one of her children was missing. Her youngest, Vivienne, had developed measles and had been placed in isolation. After 6 months, my mother was at the end of her tether. My mother is the sweetest, most mild-mannered, excruciatingly shy woman. Nevertheless, astonishingly, she found the strength to march into the office of the commander of the refugee camp. She banged on his desk, swiped all the paperwork to the floor, and in her best newly acquired English she declared, "Captain Marsh, bring my husband." To his credit, Captain Marsh did his utmost to make this happen, and shortly afterwards my father joined us in the camp. My father had been given permission to leave Egypt on condition that he abandoned his business, his home, and all his possessions. Everything was confiscated by the Egyptian authorities, and to this day we have received not a penny in compensation. The early years in England were extremely difficult for my parents. They had no money, no home, and no livelihood. Shortly after this, we were welcomed by the Birmingham Jewish community, where we were housed in a Victorian tenement building, along with half a dozen other refugees, Jewish Egyptian families. and committed to paying a nominal weekly rent. My parents, who started from rock bottom, worked unbelievably hard, living a life of deprivation and self-sacrifice. From the moment my parents arrived in England, they showed their gratitude to their British hosts by naming their newborn baby Elizabeth after the Queen of England. My father enrolled in night school to learn to speak English and soon spoke English better than any Englishman. My father became a dapper English gentleman, albeit with an Egyptian accent. When he could afford it, he bought my mother the finest clothes and had bespoke suits made for himself, along with matching bowler hats, which he wore jauntily. The pinnacle of his achievement was when he managed to buy himself a Rolls Royce. As a mitzvah, he shared his good fortune by using his car to drive many a bride to the chuppah. Vivian Bowell tells her story in her memoir, From Egypt with Love. Within a month of the Franco-British-Israeli attack on the Suez Canal, the family was forced to leave their native Cairo. Vivian's mother was British and Vivian's father was stateless. Vivian's parents signed a voluntary paper donating their property to the Egyptian state. They left with a luggage weighing 20 kilos and 20 Egyptian pounds in their pockets, while their tearful servants bid them goodbye. Vivian writes, "We landed at Heathrow on a cold and grey December morning. We were met by a government official, put on a bus and taken straight away to what was become our home for the next 3 months. We had no idea where we were going, but found out later it was Bridgend Hostel in Stonehouse in Gloucestershire. It had previously been used during World War II. The hostel consisted of prefabricated rows of pavilions. Each family had their own accommodation. The meals were adequate, but we found it difficult as it was food we did not know and were not used to. Breakfast consisted of cornflakes or a cooked one. We had never had cereal before and it tasted strange, more like cardboard. The thought of having something cooked for breakfast was totally alien. We couldn't stomach the pork sausages, baked beans, or boiled cabbage, and we were hungry most of the time. The hostel was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fields and streams. It was a cold winter, and it snowed a few days after our arrival. We were excited as we had never seen snow before. However, the shoes we had were flimsy and totally inappropriate for the weather. We ventured outside the hostel for the first time and went to Cheltenham, the nearest large town, to buy some footwear. We saw a sign above a shop which said Boots and headed straight there. But of course, it was Boots the chemist. Vivian believes that the refugees were considered a liability by the UK government, even though their uprooting was the direct result of an ill-fated British government decision to invade Egypt. She claims that the government wanted to limit post-colonial immigration. It already had a tradition of limiting Jewish immigration to Britain. Racism on account of their North African origin was also a factor. It was thought that the Egyptian Jews needed less help than the Hungarian refugees who arrived at the same time. The Egyptian Jews were seen as colonial immigrants rather than British nationals. It was not a given that the newcomers would find jobs to match their qualifications, even if they had previously worked in British companies. Refugees did get some compensation for their losses, but in most cases it was not enough. A grant of £100,000 was made to the Anglo-Egyptian Aid Society to ease their resettlement. What happened to the great bulk of stateless Jews, including the Egyptian Jews, 40% of whom were stateless? The stateless family of the writer Lucette Lanyadoo was torn between leaving for Israel or choosing America. America was not an obvious choice. For most Jewish refugees, the US was the second or third country they moved to. The Americans were looking for young and healthy immigrants who would be able to work, not older folk who would be a burden on the state. Lanyardo describes how social workers had tried to dissuade her infirm father in his 60s from making the journey to the States. Israel, on the other hand, was ready to give citizenship to Jews no matter what condition they were in. Jews with ringworm and tuberculosis, the malnourished, the elderly, and the sick converged on the young state, the huddled masses of the Arab world. But the Lanyardos chose the States. Although a number of refugees had been able to transfer some of their wealth abroad, most had to abandon their property and assets in their country of birth. The Arab governments did not allow the departing Jews to take more than £50 per person with them. This led to subterfuges. Jews sewed jewelry into the hems of dresses, or sewed gold coins as buttons, or hid jewels in cans or jars of pickles or peppers. Lucette Lanyardo's father went as far as to get his wife's jewelry sealed into canned foods, but later he had cold feet and decided not to go ahead with that ruse. And so the wealth of families like Lucette Lanyardo's was crammed into their suitcases. The Lanyardo family traveled with 26 cases. They packed warm clothes. If their final destination was to be the West, they would have to be prepared for the cold. As Lucette Lanyardo says, Europe and America may well have been Alaska or the North Pole. They thought it was always snowing over there. Some of what they chose to pack was mystifying. A yellowing wedding dress, an astrakhan coat her mother had never worn. For those with French nationality, the choice was already made. Algerian Jews were almost all French and so were repatriated to a country they had never known. France's absorption of Algerian Jews was unprecedented in the history of immigration. Only Israel was having to absorb a greater number of people. The Jews were themselves a small part of a much larger immigration of white settlers called Pieds Noirs. Over 800,000 Pieds Noirs were transplanted from Algeria. Nevertheless, 100,000 Jewish refugees arrived all at once and from all social classes and all fields. Rich and poor, farmers and traders, craftsmen and civil servants, teachers, students, doctors and engineers. Some 30% resettled in the Parisian region, around 40,000. 30,000 went to Marseille. The Jews were dispersed to towns which had never had Jews. Brest, Annecy, La Rochelle, Valence, and so on, alongside the more popular destinations of Grenoble, Cannes, which is near Nice, of course, and Rouen. The influx spawned an increase in numbers of synagogues, kosher butcher shops, and bakeries. And here's one butcher's shop we found in Paris, Boucherie Norbert from Oran. Resettlement went smoothly, mainly because France was undergoing a post-war economic boom known as the Trente Glorieuses. Jews could carry on their old professions and did not have to suffer the dislocation characteristic of new immigrants in other countries. The Jewish establishment did what it could to help the newcomers. This was a change from its timid attitude to Eastern European Jews between the wars. The Algerian Jews were joined by Tunisian and Moroccan Jews, fearful of the future once Tunisia and Morocco had become independent in 1956. Half the Jews of Tunisia had French nationality. About 5,000 Jews fled Tunisia after the 1961 Bizerte crisis, when Tunisia challenged French control over the Bizerte naval base. The Jewish refugees were destitute and were assisted by the authorities, namely the Fonds Social Juif Unifié. They settled in Marseille, Montpellier, Toulouse, Nice, and Paris. A steady flow of Jews came to France from North Africa during the 1960s. The wave peaked in 1967 in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, when Jews were harassed in Morocco and riots broke out in Tunisia. The Great Synagogue of Tunis was badly damaged. Between June and September 1967 alone, 16,000 Tunisian and Moroccan Jews reached France. Previous waves brought in small shopkeepers or rag traders who clustered in the poor Paris suburbs like Belleville or Sarcelles. In contrast, the refugees of 1967 were mainly middle class and professional. Today, the Jews from North Africa now form the majority of French Jews and have reinvigorated the community, which had been devastated by the war. 75,000 Jews, French Jews, had been deported to Auschwitz. Or I should say 75,000 Jews from France had been deported to Auschwitz. French Sephardi Jews are loud and proud Jews, unafraid to show their support for Israel, and they have mostly done well. Among leading Algerian Jews were the French minister Jacques Attali, the philosopher Jacques Derrida, the author Hélène Cixous, the magazine publisher Jean Daniel, and the public intellectual Bernard-Henri Lévy. Jews of Tunisian origin have included Gabriel Attal, who was prime minister briefly. Tunisian Jews have enriched French cultural life and include actors, singers, directors, writers, and comedians. However, in recent decades, Tunisian Jews have borne the brunt of Islamist terrorism. Sébastien Halimi, Sarah Halimi, the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists, the kosher deli victims. Some 10 Jews have been murdered by Islamist terrorists in France, and some 80,000 French Jews have moved to Israel. But in the 1950s and 60s, most stateless refugees had no idea where they would end up. All they knew was that they had to leave. And so in 1961, the Lanyardo family embarked on a ship leaving Alexandria for the unknown. Lucette Lanyardo writes, they travelled from Marseille to Paris and were put in a hotel on the Rue du Faubourg Poissonnière. The shabby residential hotels of the Faubourg did a booming business. It was possible to walk around the Rue du Faubourg Poissonnière and hear a cacophony of languages, old furriers who still spoke German and Polish and Yiddish, refugees from the Maghreb who were conversing in their native Arabic. That left French to the streetwalkers and transvestites who plied their trade in the Boulevard Saint-Denis. Paris had a relatively efficient, coordinated system of social service and relief agencies dedicated to helping refugees like my family, funded by private philanthropists such as the Rothschilds, as well as deep-pocketed American Jewish organizations. The French groups tried to lessen the trauma. Refugees were immediately given a free place to live, typically a room or two in an inexpensive hotel, along with subsidized meals. The main agency helping in Paris was Cojassor, which had once aided Holocaust victims. HIAS, that's the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, was the other major group. Their headquarters was in New York, but they had offices around Europe. Lucette Lanyardo's father went to collect his weekly allowance from Cojassor. What a come down for someone who had prospered from stocks and shares when he lived in Egypt. Some refugees report that the relief agencies gave them sufficient help. But Lucette tells how Cojassor and HIAS refused to help her father buy a raincoat. Brazil became a haven in the 1950s for Syrian, Lebanese, and stateless Egyptian Jews. Brazil was seeking to attract immigrants, and some families, like the Safras, were able to transfer their wealth. Jewish employees of US multinational companies were able to transfer their jobs to Sao Paulo, the commercial capital. Others were assisted by the refugee agency HIAS, which never demanded repayment of financial support. Children were offered free places at Jewish schools. The refugees were not allowed to take more than 20 dinars out of Egypt. They filled wooden crates with clothing and hid jewelry in the base. They also brought odd items out, like a coffee grinder, a device for chopping herbs to make the traditional molochia, or a police first aid manual. The crates were used for sleeping until the refugees could afford to buy a sofa bed in part exchange. And here you see the men sitting, the people sitting on these crates, which were used for sleeping until they could afford to buy a sofa bed. I was lucky enough to visit Brazil and see a special exhibition which the Egyptian Jews had arranged to draw attention to their exodus. About half of Brazil's 8,000 Jews were stateless. Some acquired Iranian nationality. And here we come to the bizarre tale of the Iranian passports. One refugee moved from France in the 1950s, but threw his French passport in the Seine when he was called up to the army to fight in the Algerian War. He bought an Iranian passport and left for Brazil. How was this possible? In the main, it was Lebanese and Syrian Jews who took advantage of the Iranian passport scam. Lebanon was not willing to give Lebanese nationality to its Jews, nor would it even grant residence permits. In order to leave Lebanon for a second country, a Jew needed a passport or an entry visa. The passports were effectively exit papers, allowing the bearer to leave Lebanon and apply for citizenship in a second country. The Iranian operation began after October 1948. A racket to issue false passports to fleeing Lebanese Jews, mainly of the more prominent Beda and Zarut, Matalon and Hazan families, began. The Iranian passports were nominally genuine since they bore the Embassy of Iran's stamp in Beirut. They were issued by order of the Shah of Iran. They did not entitle the bearer to enter Iran, nor did they allow the bearer to vote at Iranian consulates around the world. At first, the passport holders had no trouble renewing their documents, but Iranian embassies and consulates abroad, especially in Athens, Paris, and Milan, began to smell a rat. The passports bore false civil identity registration numbers. The game was up, and the passport holders found themselves back to square one, stateless. After he was visited by a Jewish delegation, the Shah of Iran agreed to grant Iranian nationality to the holders of false Iranian passports. There was a price to pay, however. A donation of some hundreds of thousands of dollars had to be made to the Iranian Red Crescent and Red Lion services. In the 1960s, Lebanese and Syrian Jews also managed to buy Panamanian passports. Syrian Jews were dispersed to various parts of the world. Some made their way to Israel, while sizable communities also formed in Mexico City, Argentina, and Panama. All these were looking for immigrants. Following violent riots in Aleppo and Damascus in the late 40s, several thousand Syrian Jews managed to join an existing community community in Mexico. This community dated back to the 1920s when Jews were fleeing the crumbling Ottoman Empire. The Syrian Jews recreated their version of their Middle Eastern homeland within the streets and plazas of Mexico City. But for some Jews, like Isaac Asa, Mexico was not their first choice. They wanted to come to America, but were denied entry due to concerns regarding contagious diseases. The Six-Day War had terrible repercussions on Jews still in Arab countries. The majority of fleeing middle-class Tunisian, Moroccan and Iraqi Jews chose Canada and became the mainstay of the Sephardi community. They joined existing synagogues such as the Spanish and Portuguese in Montreal and formed their own French-speaking congregations. Many immigrated directly from Morocco, but others came from France and Israel. The attraction of Francophone Quebec, especially Montreal, was obvious. They came to Canada with more assets and education than the Moroccan Jews who moved to Israel in the 1950s. The Canadian government and Jewish community organizations welcomed and supported them. Staunch supporters of Israel, they have celebrated and built on Moroccan Jewish and Sephardic culture. Canada's total population, Jewish population, was about 300,000 out of a population of 30 million. And about 8,000 Jews moved from Morocco to Canada between 1960 and 2011. In 2011, 36,000 Sephardim lived in Canada, with 22,000 in Montreal and 9,000 in Toronto. Between 7 and 8,000 of Toronto's Sephardi Jews have Moroccan ancestry. 1967 was a terrible time for the 3,000 or so Jews still remaining in Iraq. Jews were executed on trumped-up spying charges in 1969, and 40 or so Jews were arrested and never seen again. Their families were hostages and desperate to leave. Eventually, some 2,000 Jews were smuggled through the north of Iraq with the help of the Kurds and over the border into Iran. A fair number were coaxed by the Jewish Agency to stay in Israel, but once they ended up in Israel, they were not free to claim asylum in any other country. And this upset the family of Cynthia Kaplan Shamash, who set their sights on moving to England. Some managed to rejoin relatives in England, but England would not give the Iraqi Jews asylum. It would only take those armed with a letter of guarantee signed by a relative or person who would vouch for them and confirm that they would not be a burden on the state. The only place that would take the refugees was Holland, and so a small community of Iraqi Jews emerged in Amsterdam. They were housed in a dour Amsterdam apartment block with Surinamese immigrants for neighbors. Mastering Dutch was difficult. Cynthia's Jewish school was no less alien, and the pupils cliquey and spoilt. Her attempt to gain popularity by taking up horse riding literally barely got off the ground. Those Jews who managed to move to England were joining several thousand who had resettled in the 1950s, my family among them. They were a small minority who did not go to Israel. Together with Egyptian Jews, the Iraqi Jews joined the existing Spanish and Portuguese synagogues, namely Lauderdale Road, then run by Rabbi Abraham Levy. And here's another Spanish-Portuguese synagogue at Holland Park. Several families arrived in the early 1960s. One arrival was Linda Dangour, who describes the scene through the eyes of a 12-year-old in her new book here, which had just come out, From the Tigris to the Thames. Rain, rain, go away, she writes. Come again another day. I found it exotic at first, but the rain came back every day. The rain having stopped, I dashed to the small balcony of our flat to see what was outside. I was surprised to see that no one was at their window in the building opposite us. A surge of somber-attired women and men in bowler hats were hurrying along in the same direction like one undulating black mass. Were they trying to escape from some danger? I called out to my parents, "Look at the people running! Something must have happened!" Only to be told that they were most likely hurrying to catch the train or bus to go to work. What alarmed me were their numbers and their pace, so pressing and so urgent, so unlike the ambling gait of people in the Middle East. By the 1970s, the Sephardi community in the UK had grown to an estimated 20,000. It comprised Jews from Iran, mainly Mashhadi, who had arrived in the 20s and 30s, and former British colonies like Aden. Both communities established themselves in the Haredi district known as Stamford Hill. There were Jews from Egypt and Sudan and a sprinkling of Jews from North Africa. There were Baghdadi Jews from India who formed their own congregation. Sephardi minyans cropped up in established Ashkenazi synagogues. Unlikely venues became synagogues, a telephone exchange, a bus garage, and a private house with a swimming pool in Southgate, known as the Shul with the Pool. And this congregation was founded by Ilan Kahlani from Aden in his own home. And here you see him there and his swimming pool. When the Six-Day War broke out, hostile mobs rampaged in Libya, threatening the 2,500 Jews still remaining. About 19 Jews were killed. The staff of the Alitalia airline office in Tripoli realized Jewish lives were in danger and did everything possible to give them priority on their flights out of the country. They also helped Jews get money out by giving them refunds for unused tickets to far-flung destinations. Relief agencies such as the Joint, the Community of Rome, the Union of Italian Jewish Communities, the Israelite Deputation of Assistance, and OSE received the refugees from Tripoli and Benghazi. Guest houses were booked in the city, and the Italian authorities were asked to make refugee camps available. And the refugees did not stay long in the camps. They soon found work. They quickly became integrated. And there were marriages between girls from Tripoli and young Roman Jews. The Libyans soon set up their own synagogue in a rented apartment. Raphael, and this is a list of Sephardi synagogues actually in Britain. As you can see, quite a few of them, in not just in London, but in Manchester and other places. So Raphael Luzon, who was 13 at the time, he was a refugee from Benghazi in Libya. He writes about the conditions in the camp. The filthy refugee camp at Capua, our first stop in Italy, also housed Eastern European and other refugees. Soon we discovered drunkards, thieves, prostitutes, and vagrants among them. The public toilets emanated a stench that haunts me to this very day. From the beginning, we stuck together without venturing through the paved alleys of the camp. In Capua, we found Libyan Jews who had fled Tripoli. My father desperately inquired what had happened to his brother and the extended family, but found no answers. The Tripoli Jews informed him that there'd been assassinations, perhaps dozens of deaths, but no one had seen his family or knew what had happened. My father did not give up and posed the same questions to all who arrived from the Libyan capital. In those days, we children were completely free with no school and no schedule. We played all day, always having fun. However, it was only fun on the surface. Our souls were shaken and our eyes were averted from the degradation of the surroundings. After a few weeks, my mother noticed that I was feeding myself with memories and not with the food provided. I was slowly wasting away. However, the camp imprisonment was more indigestible than the bad food. My mother tried to persuade me to eat, feeding me at every meal. She cried and got angry, beating her breast. Her efforts were to no avail. What of the refugees who came to the US? The 2022 census indicated that there were 7.2 million Jews in the US, of which 1% might be Mizrahi, that's Easterners. And this includes tens of thousands of Syrian Jews who arrived in the early 20th century. And those Israelis who identify as Mizrahim, some 500,000 Israeli Jews live in the US. While most Sephardim would have arrived via Israel or France, two waves of Sephardi immigrants came directly. The first were the Iranian Jews who came after the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Many Persian Jews came as refugees from an oppressive Islamic regime which had confiscated their businesses. They were accused of spying for Israel. Some 30 Jews were executed or disappeared in the 1980s. Jews who came to the US resettled in two main areas: Great Neck, a suburb of New York, and Beverly Hills, a suburb of Los Angeles in California, also known as Tehrangeles. The Great Neck Persian community, second in size only to the one in California, is affluent and influential. There are perhaps up to 17,000 Persian Jews in the greater New York area. A Persian Jew, Dr. Pedram Bral, was elected mayor of Great Neck. And apart from Pedram Bral, here's another Iranian Jew who's made it to prominence, Anna Monahemi Kaplan. Anna Kaplan became the first Democratic senator in New York State in 2018. And she's the first Iranian Jew to have reached high public office. When she was 13, she arrived without her family at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York. She came with a group of 40 Jewish girls, all from Iran, each of them alone. Her parents had quietly bought her a ticket to Rome and sent her off, not knowing when they would see her next. The girls were greeted, processed, and issued with US student visas, and 5 days later they were safely in America. And Sharona Nazarian is another Iranian Jewish refugee from persecution, and she was recently elected mayor of Beverly Hills. The last Sephardi wave to come to America were 4,000 Syrian Jews. In 1947, riots broke out in Syria, and almost the whole community fled to Israel, to Lebanon, to the Americas, but 5,000 Jews remained, and those who did not leave became hostages for the next 50 years. Those of you as old as me might remember going on demonstrations to call for Syrian Jews to be allowed to leave. The person most closely associated with the campaign to liberate the Jews is Judy Feld-Carr. She was an Ashkenazi music teacher from Ontario, Canada, who accidentally got involved with Syrian Jews. She set up a fund to ransom ill and needy Jews. She worked secretly with Rabbi Hamra in Damascus for the release of Syrian Jews in prison and for ill Jews to be allowed to leave. He oversaw money sent from the Feld Fund and funneled grant aid from the American Jewish Committee to Jewish schools, teachers, and those in need. In 1992, 4,500 Jews were allowed to leave Syria. Judy Feld-Carr is credited with their release. But some 17 years later, Syrian Jews in the US said it was thanks to the Council for the Rescue of Syrian Jews, a committee set up in the late 1980s. And this was composed of members of the American Syrian Jewish community and aided by philanthropists like Edmund Safra, who paid for the refugees' air tickets. By way of conclusion, You don't need me to tell you that Jews living in the West, whether Ashkenazi or Sephardi, are all going through a rough time, a period of unprecedented anti-Semitism that is making them question whether the West is indeed the safe space they sought decades ago. I'm reminded of the words of a 9-year-old Jewish refugee uprooted from Algeria to Paris. She felt she had traded her lovely, happy town and sunshine for a large and cultural but noisy and cold Paris. I had to integrate into a place where we gained only one thing, a life potentially free of threats. We have seen Jews murdered, synagogues defaced, and Jews have been injured simply for taking part in a demonstration. It seems reasonable to conclude that the threats are back. Jews who settled in the West might not have reached their final destination. So thank you very much for listening. Very happy to answer any questions, or if you have any stories of your own about your departure from Arab countries, please feel free to share them. Sorry, Hannah, I tried to get out of this.
Yeah, you're doing perfectly. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A bar if you click on the bottom of your screen. Do you see that?
Sorry, is it under more? I haven't got a Q&A.
Oh
yeah, Q&A. Right, I got it.
Perfect.
Thank you. Okay, Cheryl, did many go to South Africa? I wouldn't say many did. I would say they were mainly Jews from Rhodes who probably ended up in South Africa and Rhodesia. Shelley asks, were these refugees able to take any of their money or possessions when they left the Arab countries? Well, I actually told you that most of them did not, and they had to leave everything behind. When did the Egyptian Jews start living in modern Egypt? So there's some Jews who trace their roots back to the beginning of time, to 3,000 years, 2,000 years. But the modern Jewish community is quite a recent one because what happened was when the Suez Canal opened, a lot of Jews in Syria and Turkey found that their economic situation was quite bad, and therefore they moved to Egypt. So I'd say it was quite a recent community, although it didn't mean that they hadn't lived in the Arab world before. And what do you mean when you say someone was stateless? It means that they were not citizens. They were not given any papers. They were never citizens of any country. Yeah, you're absolutely right. What is your opinion of the writings of Ella Shohat? Yeah, Ella Shohat is a Marxist, and basically she's an anti-Zionist, and she is trying to drive a wedge between Mizrahi Jews and Ashkenazi Jews, and trying to portray Mizrahi Jews in Israel as victims of the Ashkenazi establishment. And I think it's true to say that when they first arrived in the 1950s, a lot of Jews were subject to discrimination, but it's not institutional discrimination, and it's certainly nothing that has remained to the same extent, and intermarriage is such that this is not really a very credible argument anymore, I would say. A number of German Jews immigrated to Chile before and after the war. Those who survived, and many did financially very well. Well, German Jews usually do do thrive wherever they end up. Yeah, they did financially very well. Good for them. I'm not talking about Ashkenazi Jews on this occasion, obviously, but I'm glad to know that they did do well. And can you make available the references to the books you quoted? Yeah. Yes, Mel. What I could do is send them to Lockdown University, and perhaps they can share them with you. Thank you, Esther. How many of the refugees from Arab countries were actually Sephardic, Ladino speaking, originating from Spain or Sepharad? Well, I would say that some of the Egyptian Jews did have Ladino as their mother tongue, usually because they'd moved from Greece or Salonika or Rhodes or something like that, or Turkey even. There were also Moroccan Jews from the north of Morocco who might have spoken Haketia, which is a kind of Spanish. Um, and it's true that the Sephardi Jews had slightly different culinary traditions from the Mizrahi Jews. Oh, thank you, Adrienne. That's nice of you. And thank you, Rose. Thank you, Daryl. And Daryl, my aunt went from Egypt to South Africa, not a direct route. Interesting, yeah. Well, of course, yeah. There's always an exception that proves the rule. Egyptian Jews probably did end up in South Africa, but not directly. And thank you, Zoom user. Thank you, Rena. And Ruth Friedman read another of Lucette Laniado's books, The Arrogant Years. Sadly, her last book, near completion, about the. Sadly, her last book, Near Completion, was not published after her death. Yeah, that's a shame. And she died pretty young, in her early 60s. I am from Rhodesia. We had many Sephardic Jews. Yes, but these were Jews from Rhodes or Greece. I'd say not that many from Arab countries. I may be wrong, but I don't think so. We learnt a lot. My husband's elderly Egyptian relations, and they got to the UK, had no servants. They learnt how to boil the kettle. I know they had to start from scratch. My own mother had to go shopping for the first time. She couldn't rely on anyone else. Why did you hardly mention Morocco, which had the largest? I mentioned Morocco, Eva. I mentioned Moroccan Jews who went to France, and I mentioned Moroccan Jews who went to Canada. And the only Arab countries were not thrown out the country. Well, slightly controversial there. I'd say that there was no policy to throw them out. However, that's not the same as saying that they did not experience any kind of discrimination or violence or the threat of violence. Stuart Seidel, very interesting. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Laurie. Oh, thank you. They were gobsmacked. Yeah, my mother arrived in London via Cairo and Alexandria, having survived Auschwitz. Oh my goodness. Thank you, Rhonda. Thank you. Is that it?
I think so.
Yep. Okay. Oh, wait, no, there's
Mhm.
there's another one. I'm from Rhodesia. My dad was born in London, grew up in Egypt, and at the end of 16 was told to take his 14-year-old sister to the Congo to be married. Our community was primarily from Rhodes. Yes, that's what I thought. To this day, with fewer than 100 Jews remaining, they still maintain the Sephardi and Ashkenazi shuls. That's good to know. Thank you for that, Linda. Okay. So I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Lyn.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you to everyone who joined me. And have a good evening.
Yes. Good night to everyone and good evening.